dans la description de cette conversation, ce qui était mis en avant, c'est les pratiques archivistes qui sont liées à l'institution et qui sont aussi non institutionnelles. Donc, je pense que c'est intéressant de réfléchir à ça aussi ensemble. Ce qui est vu, ce qui ne l'est pas, et ce qui ne l'est pas, où est-ce qu'on peut aller trouver. Et puis, je pense, une chose aussi assez intéressante ici, c'est cette question de se rappeler, de se remémorer, et en même temps, l'idée de l'oubli. Et tout ce qui se passe entre les deux. Qu'est-ce qui se passe entre l'oubli, donc l'amnésie, et la mémoire? Et un dernier point, bien sûr, l'archive vivante. Donc, l'humain comme archive, comment est-ce que cela se manifeste dans le travail que tous nos panélistes font. Je vais te passer le micro juste pour te présenter brièvement. On va commencer plus tard par Sarah, qui voudrait réagir sur cette question de se rappeler et oublier et ce qui se passe entre les deux. Okay, sorry. Okay. But short. The different points that I just evoked, the seen and the unseen, power politics when it comes to the archive, storytelling, remembering and forgetting, and what happens in between. People as archive, investigation. Actually, I forgot about that one. And I said that you wanted to start first, reacting on this question of remembering and forgetting. But before you go, I would like everybody to say, following the rule of Mancha, who they are. That's where we start, what they do, where they come from.
Okay. My name is Ntone Jabe, and I come from Cape Town at this moment, where I edit a publication called Chimurenga, which is, yeah.
My name's Sada bin Safwan. I'm a curator at Guggenheim Abu Dhabi.
Greetings, everyone. Good to see you here. My name is Awa Kunate, and I'm an assistant curator at Guggenheim Abu Dhabi.
My name is Amandine Nana, and I'm from Paris, and I'm a curator at Palais de Tokyo, a contemporary art center in Paris, and also a founder of like an organization called Transplantation, which is a space and archive dedicated to African diasporic imaginaries.
Okay, so I'll be starting today, and please excuse me, I'll be reading off of my notes on my phone. I'm not doing anything else there. I like to think of archives as something that is constantly growing and generative, in the sense that there can be multiple sources of contribution to it from any place and any period, which can ultimately change the context of that moment or history. It's almost as if it's a living organism. They not only hold factual evidence, but also memory, emotion, and truth. I became interested in archives because of how much I realized that archives play a fundamental role in the way all of these facets can be digested, which is why archives are so powerful. They hide as much as they show. They can be manipulated, controlled, destroyed, depending on who takes power over that archive. So it is in a sense that as much as we believe that archives are evidence to truth, they are just as fragile, vulnerable, and unreliable as memory is. Looking at these tensions between the reliability of memory, and the ways that artists and curators have been using it in their practices, because we are able to unravel forms of visibility that may not have been so noticeable. These archives stand as a witness and testimony to these moments in histories that may have been otherwise lost or forgotten. Archives are transformational. Archival material has long been a source for contemporary artists for decades, as we have seen through the so-called archive fever. Through artistic practices and intervention, artists are able to create a generative archive that continues to be created, whether through the translation or documentation of spaces, events, and people. Without human interpretation, the archive is in a state of dormancy. Artworks are fueled with memory, allowing them to become a site of testimony and truth. Letters, reports, photographs, video, sound recordings, found objects can all be seen as recorded evidence of history, and if handled correctly, we are able to unearth the memories and truths that lie within them. Through the excavation and readings of these materials, we are able to investigate crucial information to examine our relationship with the past in order to gain a better understanding of our present, as well as raise questions about the future. The methods in which these resources are stored, organized, accessed, interpreted, and kept and/or destroyed, and ultimately altered and controlled, reveal how the archive is also employed as a system of power and knowledge. The archive, to some, may be envisioned as an antiquated, untouched storage room with endless cabinets and drawers full of static documents. However, to artists and the curiously inclined, the archive unfolds memories, emotions, facts, and perspectives as a means to think critically about the role of history, memory, and forgetting to shape our understanding of the world around us. The archive is no longer a static medium, but rather a dynamic, fluid, and complex world that may be appropriated, coded, and reinterpreted as a powerful instrument to uncover truth and as used as a form of resistance against dominated narratives within post-conflict societies. Within layers of politics and memory, the past is not a fixed narrative of time, but one that holds a multitude of meaning. As Michel Foucault explains in the book Archaeology of Knowledge, the archive is not that which, despite its immediate escape, safeguards the event of the statement and preserves for future memories its status as an escapee. It is that which, at the very root of the statement event, and in that which embodies it, defines at the outset the system of its enunciability. Nor is the archive that which collects the dust of statements that have become inert once more, and which may make possible the miracle of their resurrection. It is that which defines the mode of occurrence of the statement thing. It is the system of its functioning. Understanding the archive as a possessor of power, the access and control of it is a construct of political and cultural tools that can be shaped as well as manipulated, censored, and controlled in order to include or exclude, remember or forget, accept or deny. Jacques Derrida says in Archive Fever, there is no political power without control of the archive, if not memory. Effective democratization can always be measured by this essential criterion: the participation in and access to the archive, its constitution, and its interpretation. In a countering method, contemporary artists are able to create their own non-institutional systems of archiving within their work and create decentralized and alternative methods of categorization and preservation. Through their work, they are able to contest and interrogate the hierarchical modes of narration and record-making to disrupt the institutional practice of official archives and narratives, offering a multidimensional perspective to certain events. As our curatorial work continues further to dismantle and shift away from Western art historical thought and mainstream canon and turn inwards to ourselves, and here I'm speaking in context to the Arab region, a region that has undergone continuous war and erasure, we are able to unearth and save so many stories, histories, and artist practices that are using archives within. We collect artists that not only commemorate specific moments in history, but directly critique the notion of systems of memory and archive itself. Take the work for Guggenheim Abu Dhabi collection artist Akram Zaatari, which is the work that I have displayed here above me. For example, where he studies photographs in order to excavate their stories and their truth. The Lebanese artist looks for what remains after something vanishes, what settles down after contamination has taken place, or what gets reconfigured by accidental binding. He tries to learn from these accidents or phenomena and deploys them as tools into the making of what he calls informed objects, or objects that can speak of what they have been through. Zaatari gives a voice to what has once been an untouched, unalive archive. His collecting practice is a working method that led him to accumulate many objects and documents, most of which are now part of the Arab Image Foundation's collection, a nonprofit organization informed by a strong artistic, curatorial, and discursive educational stance founded by Zaatari, which is aimed at collecting, preserving, and studying photographs from West Asia and North Africa and its diaspora. Zaatari especially explores the archive of Studio Shahrazadeh in Saida and the work in photographer Hashim al-Madani. As an artist, he is not only interested in the stories that photographic records tell, but also in them as traces of a growing industry of image production and diffusion. He belongs to a generation of artists who are heirs to a conceptual and media critical art that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in Lebanon, many of whom have their work rooted in photography, a medium that moves freely between documentation and subjectivity, between archive and memory. As such, the artist's impulse to obsessively collect and dissect comes from a need to save a memory that are always at the threat of erasure and loss. So what does this all mean in context of Guggenheim Abu Dhabi? Situated in a young country with a strong oral tradition and archives mostly sitting within private homes or state-level archives, we can begin to open conversations around archives within the museum that can be powerful tools to recognize and validate diverse histories, giving voice to histories that are often overlooked and support artists and initiatives leading the work. By involving artists, researchers, and community members, the archive can serve as a living, collaborative space, honing a deeper understanding of shared heritage and continuously evolving as a resource for learning and reflection. With great shared responsibility not only to the arts, but to the history of the region, moving away and rejecting Western validation, this approach moves away from the idea of museums as gatekeepers of knowledge, instead positioning them as partners, caretakers, and allies in providing access and preserving, reinterpreting culture and histories. Therefore, we can understand that the power of countering, remembering, activating, and speaking are modes of resistance to the systematic powers at play. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I think just to follow up on Sarah's point and thinking through the conversation I had with Marie-Hélène and thinking through really the idea of archives and memory in my work, but also personal memory. I think the way I'll begin my part of the presentation is to really introduce myself, because I am, like several of my fellow co-panelists here, initially an independent curator who's now transitioned into the institution. And I think when we talk about archives and working with non-Western artists within that perspective, it's also important to recognize that we come from different trajectories and thinking through that in an institutional framework. I am from Abidjan originally, but I grew up in Copenhagen in Denmark. And prior to joining Guggenheim, I am the founder of a curatorial platform, very much research-led curatorial platform called CAS, which is an abbreviation for Culture Art Society. And I founded that really in 2013, growing up in Copenhagen and feeling myself incredibly frustrated by the absence of Black art in an institutional framework, but also noticing and being able to see the very visible traces of Black art's presence within Denmark and widely the Scandinavian region. And so I founded CAS as a response to that very deliberate erasure and absence, and really thinking through how, in my own capacity as a person who is Afro-Scandinavian, I could try to unearth and access archives to be able to insist on the historical but also cultural and artistic presence of Blackness in Scandinavia. And so the way that work then continued to develop ongoingly is, also talking about archives, coming from a Tumblr generation, which me and Nadine Nadine very much have in common, using the digital platform as a way to think through archives and as a way to think through knowledge production that is accessible and non-hierarchical and can very much easily be disseminated across borders. And so I founded CAS on Instagram in 2013, and which is where my archival research very much grew. So my archival practice is also informed by the digital space and the digital sphere. And so that's how my work began, and really trying to think through that work and my own roots within archival practice. I turn really, I think I insist on turning to the archive as a site of, as a site where I'm able to think through and really insist on how African descendant artists are actually beyond the site of the archival record itself. And so since joining Guggenheim about 1.5 years ago, my work now, it's mainly the capacity of collection building, particularly with focus on the African collections and African artists or Afro-descendant artists generally. So continental as well as diasporic, where I have some kind of knowledge. And how do I apply that work? Living in Abu Dhabi and being an archive-led curator is very challenging in many ways, because Abu Dhabi does not really have a presence of at least tangible material archives related to African art in the way that, say, other epicenters across Europe, such as Paris and London, where I lived for many years, does. But nevertheless, part of that ongoing archival research that I have been doing is to actually draw on people as archives. So because my work is so archival-led, I have to extensively rely on thinkers like so many of those that were present in this room and their work to be able to also trace my own archival practice. And apologies in advance, but I wasn't able to submit the photo in time. But one specific context or example I'd like to provide is with our collection artist, the South African artist, Ernest Mankoba. And I want to draw on Mankoba because it relates to my raising in Copenhagen as well, where he lived in Denmark for many years. So Ernest Mankoba is an collection artist of ours from South Africa, lived in Paris for many years, and was really one of the pioneering figures of the Cobra movement, the Cobra group, and very much an important figure within the shaping of abstract expressionism in Europe. But art historically, there's been such an absence within the Scandinavian region to actually recognize an African figure who left South Africa in the 30s, or is it 40s, and then moved to Paris, crossed through that axis, and then went on to Scandinavia, where he actually influenced the birth of an entire movement that has sort of radical shift within the art expression of Europe. And so part of my ongoing interest in research is to be able to also, in my work as for the collection building for Guggenheim, is to insist, I think it in many ways, to insist on, one, honoring the intellectual and artistic labor of African descendant artists, and two, also thinking through the ways in which that we're able to foreground an insistence on how there's a shared curatorial and artistic language amongst, historically, culturally, amongst artists from parts of the global South, those that one would call non-Western. And part of that insistence is also to draw on the archive and these traces of memory in whatever way one is able to access them, to insist that we actually share a common language in many ways, regardless of how we speak through our various cultural interventions. And I think also through thinking through the collection building work for GAD with focus on the African artists, is to also in some way, I say very often that as if you are obsessed with archives, or at least being able to access various, trying to uncover, rather unearth dormant stories in some extent, because I don't really believe that any story is overlooked. When people say something is overlooked, I always ask, but to whom is it actually overlooked? But when you are able to access the archives and engage with that material, you find very often within a contemporary context, especially working as a curator, I think institutions very often do not give African artists, contemporary, may I add, the privilege of history and the privilege of art history. So very often when there is a framing within the exhibition framework, it's like, oh, this is the first person to do this is the first person to do that. So there's an insistent dominance of the idea of the first. But once you engage with the archive and you're able to trace these artistic developments and histories, it's very obvious that we're all working in a continuum of a genealogy that has existed for thousands of years. And so part of my interest in working with archives within GAD for the collection building is to also insist that artists that come into our collection, vis-a-vis their presence within the city of Abu Dhabi, which is so multicultural and historically so also relevant with regards to its history with the African continent, it's to be able to also say that actually there are traces of a contemporary author, a modernist artist like Ernest Mankoba, who works through spirituality in his work in the form of painting, but also alike other artists, modernists from the Arab region that have also crossed through Abu Dhabi. And I think one last thing I also would like to maybe conclude with this is that going back to my point about relying on people as archives. So one example is another collection artist that we have, who is the eminent Obiora Uduchukwu, who was a colleague of Ella Natsui and who's now in our collection. Obiora was part of the Nsukka school in Nsukka, Nigeria in the 70s, and a colleague of Ella Natsui, and such a formidable artist, truly. But scholarly, there's not that much material that one can access on Obiora working from Abu Dhabi. And so because I'm not always able to access archival materials to do my research, especially in the context of trying to provide curatorial reports and scholarly context for why these artists are in the collection, I actually had a lengthy 4-hour conversation with Obiora where he walked me through his entire artistic trajectory. And I think, in the present moment with the work that I'm doing in collection building, it is such an, undescribable privilege to have so many of those older artists still with us today. And part of my curatorial work with that collection building is to also foreground the voices of the artists themselves to actually shape and help inform how we think through archives in the museum's collection. And so something very interesting about Obiora, going back to my point about our shared languages for non-Western artists, he told me that he spent time in China as an artist who's very inspired by calligraphy, or rather the tradition of Uli in Nigeria, and also thinking through the similarities between Uli and calligraphy in China. And he spent time in China in the 70s and very much was able to incorporate part of that visual aesthetic in his work and thinking through the relationship between these countries that are so far apart. And so the artist here is the archival record, really. And part of my duty as a curator is to be able to also insist that non-Western artists have always spoken to each other regardless of their location. Now, going back to my colleague Sarah's point about archiving, it's very difficult to do an archival practice in Abu Dhabi because, well, one, as an institution, we're not an archival institution. I think that's also quite important to emphasize, although we're all interested in archives in our many different ways, but also to working on a collection building with focus on or priority given to with my own focus on African artists. I think I'll return to that point in a moment, and then maybe this will open up a conversation. Thank you.
Bonjour. I think I will speak in French, but I will just maybe introduce what I'm going to say in English. As like Awa, I also have an independent practice before joining Palais de Tokyo. And the specificity of my practice was that it was very much community rooted. So it was very people centered. When I started transplantation, there's nomadic space that now is going to be a long-term space. We are opening a long-term space in 2 weeks, but that started as a nomadic project where we were doing exhibition, but also showing archives in a way that it was the archives that we were showing were connected to my art historical research. I was researching and tracing a kind of counter-narrative on African art in the post-war period. And you were mentioning Ernest Mokoba. It's interesting because one of my first projects with transplantation in 2020, we opened a space in Montparnasse, which is the historical cosmopolitan neighborhood in Paris that has this long history during the 1930s to the 1960s to have host artists coming from all around the world. And now it's just bourgeois neighborhood that people don't see as cosmopolitan, that has been gentrified since the 1980s maybe. And since we were in that context, we were showing an exhibition of contemporary French and Belgian artists, and how the idea was to present a new art scene of artists navigating between 2 post-colonial cities, Francophone city, Paris and Brussels. And also how doing that to escape what you were saying of this is new, there is new Black artists, to also remind the past of this neighborhood, and that was already hosting Ernest Mankoba, Beaufort Delaney, and other African artists, but not only artists, but also students. I was doing research on like African student magazines and African student magazine who were doing visit to exhibition or sharing their perspective on culture in the 1950s. So the show was like, it was a small space, so it was like contemporary art, and then also this archive to try to create a conversation between the past and like now, and escape this trap to maybe think that this is new, what is happening in France, where there is a lot of like new emerging artists with like African background, and like the critical art scene is like approaching them as like a new thing, the first people, like although they used to have these stories. This is for the English part. And so I would talk now in French about like educational project that we do with transplantation since 2021, which is a workshop where we invite like people with African background to come with their archives, personal archives, family archives, and we build like a creative form, questionnaire, to help them to connect with their archives, and how it's also something, this relationship of like African immigrant with their family archives is something that I'm also interested in now at Palais de Tokyo, with like artistic practice that like address this difficult relationship that we can have with showing this archive in like institutional context for these young artists. Donc voilà. Et donc j'ai commencé ce projet avec une des autres membres de Transplantation, qui est une association, mais également un collectif. Et c'était vraiment, c'est un atelier qui s'appelle Lire nos archives, écouter nos histoires, et qui prend la forme vraiment, c'est des petits groupes qui se constituent, où les personnes viennent avec, donc comme je disais, des archives personnelles. Et au cours de cet atelier commun, à travers des questions, mais aussi des dessins, enfin des invitations à dessiner des éléments de ces archives qui retiennent l'attention, mais aussi à essayer de se souvenir ou d'imaginer quelle sorte de musique on pouvait écouter au moment de l'archive. C'est essayer de penser d'autres manières plus sonores aussi, et sensibles. Donc c'est vraiment une approche sensible, et ça crée vraiment des moments très émouvants, parce que qui m'ont permis de comprendre justement ce que je disais, cette relation assez difficile à ces archives familiales, ou pour beaucoup de familles immigrées ouest-africaines, et donc les enfants issus de ces immigrations. Il y a souvent aussi peu d'accès même à leurs propres archives personnelles, ou pas une manière de penser les montrer en dehors. Ça peut être assez mal vu de vouloir les montrer en dehors, parce que ça peut, enfin, il y a la peur aussi la peur de, enfin, je sais pas, enfin, de sorcellerie ou autre, de pouvoir le mauvais sort qu'on pourrait. Donc cette relation-là aux archives familiales qui ont encore, auxquelles les Africains donnent aussi, enfin, en tout cas la photographie, cette force-là, c'est quelque chose auquel on s'est confronté, et qui nous a mené aussi à travailler donc avec deux familles qui avaient été en France dans les années 70. Et pareil, là, il y a eu des moments assez, enfin, pour raconter une anecdote, il y avait une des familles avec qui travaillait, qui était donc une famille camerounaise, et il y avait la peur de la grand-mère justement, qu'on montre ces archives-là sur le compte de transplantation comme une exposition virtuelle. Il y avait vraiment cette crainte-là. Il y avait aussi la crainte, même le fait que je sois d'une ethnie banouké, et elle, sa famille Bassa, enfin, qui remonte à une histoire coloniale particulière du Cameroun, mais voilà, la crainte même que ces archives puissent être que je puisse en faire quelque chose de négatif. Donc c'est vraiment cette ambivalence-là dans ces relations aux archives qui m'a beaucoup intéressée, et qui m'intéresse aussi aujourd'hui dans le travail que je fais avec les artistes. Dans ma dernière exposition qui s'appelle Tituba qui pour nous protéger, qui est actuellement au Palais de Tokyo si vous venez à Paris, il y a deux artistes, toutes les artistes ont un rapport à l'archive, même quand elle n'est pas visible. Ça, c'est ce que tu parlais aussi de l'humain comme aussi une archive. Mais il y a deux artistes qui, je trouve, utilise des archives Massabielle Brun, des archives familiales, et qui en fait le fait d'une manière où elle se demande comment aussi protéger ces archives d'un regard voyeuriste du public. Et donc elle met cela en forme, avec des sortes de fenêtres. Je n'ai pas d'image pour vous projeter, mais elle retravaille ses archives familiales et elle les encadre avec des fenêtres. Et elle me disait par exemple qu'elle serait capable de venir le soir fermer ses fenêtres si elle a soudainement peur que le public puisse faire du mal à ses archives. Et de même, d'autres artistes avec qui on a eu ces conversations, comme Monica Emmanuel Kazi, c'était quand on partage des histoires personnelles en tant qu'artiste issu de ces immigrations et sachant aussi la relation qu'on entretient dans nos cadres familiales avec ces archives, comment en fait les présenter d'une manière qui ne soit pas voyeuriste et qui ne soit pas exhibitionniste aussi. Monica aussi, il y avait aussi la fenêtre, enfin elle mettait aussi des fenêtres pour protéger les archives. Donc ce thème de la protection, qui était le thème de la protection spirituelle, se matérialisait au sein de l'exposition avec ces pratiques-là qui touchent aux archives familiales, mais de manière matérielle, donc avec des fenêtres qui protégeaient et des manières d'essayer de sanctuariser, de mettre même des motifs protecteurs. Donc c'est ce qui m'intéresse, comment ces artistes dans des contextes institutionnels, pense aussi à ce que ça signifie de montrer ces archives et de comment se protéger même du visiteur. Voilà.
Merci, Amandine. Commencer. D'abord, je vais essayer de dire ça en français. Comme la conférence de Berlin se passe maintenant dans nos bouches. Je travaille avec un groupe, dans le contexte d'un groupe à Cape Town et ailleurs. Et un des outils qu'on utilise dans notre travail, c'est la librairie. Dans son sens le plus utopique, je pense. L'archive ne m'intéresse pas particulièrement. Ce qui m'intéresse, c'est la promesse démocratique de la librairie. Je pense que c'est un privilège de participer, mais aussi de partager dans le contexte de cette réunion, parce que, à mon avis, notre grand frère Mantia, c'est un des intellectuels, des historiens qui, tout le long de sa carrière, en tout cas que je sois au courant, essaye de réconcilier la librairie des études africaines avec la librairie des études noires. Et je pense que c'est un projet très important et je pense que c'est un des fondements du travail qu'on essaie de faire à Chimurenga. C'est de déstabiliser cette distinction entre cette étude du monde, cette connaissance du monde qui est basée sur une sorte de area study, c'est-à-dire observation de développement sociaux et autres, philosophiques et autres, sur un territoire donné, même si c'est à l'étendue d'un continent comme l'Afrique. Cette librairie néfaste, des études africaines, très dangereuses, très violentes, et puis une sorte de réponse qui dure au moins 2 siècles déjà, qui émane d'abord de l'espace qu'on considère la diaspora, de produire sa propre histoire, son propre langage, etc., qui devient constitué comme une sorte de discipline au XXe siècle qu'on appelle Black Studies, les études noires. Et Et je pense qu'il y a des trajectoires artistiques, intellectuelles et autres, politiques, on le sait. Nous sommes à Dakar, qui ont continuellement essayé de réconcilier ces deux librairies-là. Nous, je pense qu'on se met un peu dans cette lignée. Donc, merci à Mantia, mais aussi à ceux qui l'ont inspiré. Par exemple, Ole Shrinka qui est avec nous depuis plusieurs jours. Ce projet qu'il appelle Abibiman, je crois qu'il en parlait encore aujourd'hui, c'est cette déclaration de penser vivre le monde euh, comme un homme noir, le monde noir, the black world. Yeah, OK. Le disruptif dans tout ça, à mon avis, c'est le mot black. En Afrique du Sud, où je vis, c'est le scandale, le grand scandale de la fin des années 60, c'était la connexion, le mariage de deux termes, black et consciousness. De mettre ces deux termes ensemble a créé un scandale qui a finalement produit ce qu'on considère la révolution sud-africaine. Donc, le disruptif, pour moi, c'est black. Bon. Et je dis ça parce que dans le contexte des études africaines, ce qu'on n'est pas supposé articuler, c'est une sorte de conscience de race. Ce n'est pas supposé exister. On est supposé parler de religion, démocratie et autre chose. Mais la race, ça, c'est les affaires des gens de la diaspora. C'est eux qui sont obsédés avec la race. Nous, ça ne nous concerne pas. C'est justement ça la division fondamentale. Donc, vous pouvez avoir une grande écrivaine comme Chimamanda qui vous dira que la race, elle ne le connaissait pas jusqu'à ce qu'elle arrive en Amérique. Et quelque part, c'est vrai aussi. C'est vrai, comment on produit une étude de soi à partir d'ici n'est pas nécessairement médiée par la race, même si toutes les institutions qu'on utilise pour produire cette histoire de soi à partir d'ici, elles sont racialisées dès le départ, que ce soit le système universitaire ou autre. Un des projets que nous étudions dans notre librairie en ce moment, c'est un projet que le grand écrivain et cinéaste Semben Ousmane Semben, a développé et sur lequel il a travaillé pratiquement toute sa carrière de cinéaste, mais qu'il n'a jamais réussi à réaliser ou peut-être à compléter. Je ne sais pas quel est le mot exact. C'est un projet de film qu'il développait depuis 1962. Je précise la date parce que 62, c'est l'année où il est allé à Moscou pour étudier filmmaking. Et donc, c'est en fait, on pourrait dire, le projet qu'il est devenu cinéaste pour réaliser. Parce qu'on sait bien qu'il avait une carrière bien établi de novelliste, de romancier, avant qu'il se mette au cinéma. Et quelque part, sa carrière de cinéaste est une sorte de rehearsal. et une sorte de répétition. Yeah. Et, en tout cas, c'est comme ça qu'on choisit de lire son projet cinéma. Il l'a décrit comme le projet Samori. Et toute la pratique, la méthode, l'esthétique qu'il développe au fur et à mesure de comment dire des histoires, c'est pour pouvoir réaliser ce projet. Pas seulement un projet sur ce qu'on voit à l'écran, mais le réaliser dans le sens, je pense, le plus complet de la phrase, c'est-à-dire que la dimension de production, la dimension des partenariats, la dimension des circulations, qui paye pour le film, qui fait le film, qui voit le film, comment est-ce qu'il circule. Et cette réunion, en tout cas, cette réconciliation de ces différentes librairies dont je parlais avant, c'est ce que nous avons finalement, en tout cas, nos ancêtres ont finalement commencé à appeler le panafricanisme. Et je pense que Sembène essayait de faire un film panafricain. Pas seulement, il y a des institutions panafricaines, il y a même des institutions panafricaines dans le domaine du cinéma. Mais toutes ces institutions panafricaines, en fait, renforcent, je dois trouver mes mots à chaque fois, mais toutes ces institutions, je veux dire que au départ et dans son développement, une des premières et claires targets du panafricanisme politique, artistique et autres, c'est l'État-nation. C'est de détruire l'État-nation, ouais, de proposer autre chose. Et donc, je précisais ça pour dire les institutions panafricaines dans le domaine du cinéma renforcent l'État-nation. Si vous prenez par exemple, ou en tout cas toutes les institutions panafricaines que nous avons, commençons par l'OUA, ouais? Donc c'est qu'est-ce que je voulais dire? C'est un exemple en fait, mais cette institution à laquelle je fais référence, ça s'appelle la FEPACI, la Fédération panafricaine de cinéma. Et comme fédération, ses membres sont issus des membres d'États-nations. Voilà. Voilà un peu la configuration que nous avons commencé à nommer panafricain. C'est en fait une structure bureaucratique, une structure de gouvernance. Rien à voir avec les idéaux politiques ou même culturels. Donc, le projet de Sembène, c'était de ce film en particulier, c'était de produire un film, ça c'est ma lecture, je précise, qui prend au sérieux la circulation, qui prend au sérieux la déstabilisation des cartographies dans lesquelles nous vivons et créons, qui prend au sérieux le fait que on peut se débarrasser de toutes les dimensions identitaires, noires, hommes, femmes et autres, mais on a du mal de se débarrasser du caractère national, qui prend au sérieux toutes ces questions. Je pense que je vais m'arrêter là, c'est trop long. Yeah? Merci.
Merci. Bon, merci à vous tous. Merci, Ntone. Je pense que j'ai une question pour Awa. Tu as beaucoup parlé de la difficulté. J'ai une question pour Awa et j'ai un commentaire pour Ntone. Donc, tu as beaucoup parlé de la difficulté de trouver les archives à Abu Dhabi. Et que, oui, je pense que ça devient du coup une sorte de mission que d'en trouver. Et je voulais te demander, peut-être qu'il faut reconsidérer l'archive à Abu Dhabi. En fait, qu'est-ce que l'archive? Est-ce qu'on doit toujours repenser ou penser à l'archive comme le matériel, donc les images, les œuvres d'art, etc. Ou est-ce qu'on peut plutôt trouver un moyen d'identifier les archives qui sont là et qu'on ne voit pas parce qu'on nous a éduqués à ne pas les considérer comme telles? Et le commentaire pour Tony, c'est surtout lié maintenant au caractère d'investigation par rapport au projet de Samben, parce qu'on sait que c'est un projet qui n'a pas, le film n'a pas été fait, on va dire ça comme ça. Mais l'ambition de ta recherche, c'est de pouvoir connecter différentes histoires qui sont liées à ce film. Rencontrer des personnes qui ont été des témoins de ce projet. Donc, même s'il n'a pas été réalisé, il y a quelque chose de très important à investiguer et c'est le chemin sur lequel tu t'es mis. Comment est-ce que quel est le processus d'investigation dans lequel tu t'es engagé? Et qui sont parce que tu as parlé du fait de travailler au-delà des frontières, c'est ce qu'ils voulaient faire. Donc, on parle de quels endroits, quelle géographie et quelles personnes?
Merci pour la question, Marie-Hélène. Bon, en fait, je parle français très bien, mais je ne sais pas si je peux maîtriser une conversation sur les archives en français. Là, je vais vous donner votre réponse en anglais. So the question that Mary-Hélène was asking me was about my earlier point about the difficulties around accessing archives, so material archives to support the research that I do in Abu Dhabi. And to answer her question very effectively, while it is a challenge for me, I'm also not, my understanding of archive, it's not that it's something entirely tangible. It doesn't have to be a physical material for me to be able to engage and draw on that for my thinking and my work. And this goes back to what I was presenting earlier in the conversation when I said, growing up in Copenhagen and Denmark, where there's an archival presence that structures the city itself. You have buildings that are archives in many ways. You have cultural memories, traces, visual traces that are archives themselves. And you have, certain cultural lexicons and what can draw on as archives. So one perfect example is in Denmark. We have this logo, we have this coffee brand logo called Cirkelpigen, which means the circle girl. And it's a work from the 1950s that has won some of the most respected accolades within the field of design in the Nordic region. It was designed by a graphic designer in 1952, and it's of a Black Congolese woman with a braided hairstyle. And it's distributed on a particular brand of coffee and has been doing so since the 50s. And so growing up as an African descendant person in Copenhagen, I would think to myself that it is so strange to be reminded that the presence, and I'm speaking now about archives, the presence of Black people in this country only began in the 60s or in the 70s with focus on migration, with a particular migration of from the African continent to the country. And so I was fascinated by this design for years. And I remember just thinking to myself, it is so strange that this violent and yet visible and invisible way in understanding Blackness within this particular context. This is not artistic, but I will return to a point of the art, the curatorial thinking around this. And you dig into archives and you become interested. And also Denmark, and I think what the Nordic region has done very well is that there's a very, very strong culture of archiving in the Nordic region. There's a strong culture of archives. So you have institutions that hold so much archival material and that one can actually easily access to an extent. Oh, did we lose it? No. Okay. That one can very easily access. And so here is, hello? Okay. So here is 15-year-old me going to the Royal Library in Copenhagen and being interested in seeing these materials that are there and unearthing within a week's time an entire trajectory of Danish colonial history. I mean, something very interesting about, and again, that woman, the work of that woman was my cue to be able to understand the presence of a work that is an archive, that is a visual archive and a cultural archive, but not so much a material archive that is dormant within an institution. But nevertheless, I relied on the material within an institutional framework to understand this work. And so this work led me to understanding that Denmark was one of the first countries to have colonial expeditions in the global south. It led me to understanding that Denmark had colonies in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and that the first election the Danish women voted for in 1919 was for the sale of the Danish West Indies island. That was when white Danish women were given some kind of legislative power in a colonial context. So that's one example of that. So, but working in Abu Dhabi, of course, and, you know, I don't have tangible materials or as easy access to it as I did when I was in London or elsewhere. But as an African descendant person, you see a cultural archive. And I think, Sarah, you'll be able to speak better to this, but in the culture of music in the country, without any doubt, you see presences of Africanness in certain cultural aspects. And you also see people who are African descendant, and those people are also an archive of that history and Africa's confluence within the region. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah, so Marilyn, what was the question? Right. So yeah, that's very important to bring back. Le film n'a pas été fait. Même comme Semben a travaillé pendant 40 ans dessus, ça n'a pas été complété. Mais au lieu simplement d'en parler comme un film qui n'a pas été fait, on choisit de le regarder comme un film qui n'est pas faisable. C'est-à-dire les conditions de production que Semben a insérées. C'est-à-dire qu'il a inséré ce que moi je lis comme des obstacles self-induced qui rendaient le film pratiquement infaisable, impossible. Une des ambitions du projet, et c'est pour ça qu'on le lit en fait comme une sorte de laboratoire, une sorte de terrain d'expérimentation, une sorte de répétition, un peu comme tous les spectacles de Fela Kuti, c'était en fait des répétitions. Mais donc, l'ambition du projet, comme je la lis, c'était de dire une histoire qui est plus grande que storytelling. How do you say storytelling? Narration, voilà. De dire une histoire plus grande que la narration. Et à son avis, ces deux aspects, l'aspect historiographique et l'aspect cartographique, les deux impossibilités, c'est-à-dire une histoire qu'aucune personne ne peut dire et une histoire que personne ne peut dire de nulle part. C'est-à-dire, does that make sense? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So a story that's bigger than storytelling because no one person can tell it and no one can tell it from one place. That's the project he attempted to narrate. And so he gave himself a set of a kind of methodology to test these limits. One was to think collaboratively. Of course, every film is made collaboratively. No one person makes a film, but to think it collaboratively. So he invited 5 filmmakers, each of them through the accident of birth, being born in the territory, what we call the territory of the story. Each of them, through the accident of birth, having grown up in the territory of the story. The territory of the story is the space between, I think, from Ghana all the way to Guinea. That's essentially the Wasulu Empire that Samori formatted, right? And so there's a way that Semben instrumentalizes citizenship. what became our fate, because some white men met in Berlin in 1884, Semben decides to instrumentalize it and turn it into something to work with, as opposed to lamenting what happened from that day to us as a divided people. He decides to turn the fact of Senegal, the fact of Mali, of all these places we have since become part of. He decides to turn it into an instrument of liberation, an instrument of narrative liberation. That's one of the methods of the project. The other method of the, I mean, there's several. All of these methods, when you assemble them, make the project unrealizable. And so what does that mean when someone works for 40 years incessantly on a project that they know is unrealizable? What does that mean? So the project, in my view, is not a study on Samori Touré. The project, in my view, is a study on the question of the realizable. The realizable in another context. And by that, artistic, political, and otherwise, that our greatest intellectuals have worked on incessantly for 2 centuries and have consistently failed. I mean, there are periodic manifestations of it, Festac, Dakar, and so forth. There are different attempts, but all of these attempts, they don't mark the possibility of Pan-Africanism. They mark its impossibility. So that's another project that we've worked on consistently for 2 centuries, knowing it's unrealizable. What is the political predisposition that allows us to work on things that are doomed to fail? Because something in me suggests that that may be the kind of political development we need to undergo, is to prepare ourselves to fail. We've been speaking about Glissant's museum and his perspective on museology, but the museum that Glissant conceived, M2MA, which he intended for Martinique in the 80s, that museum was never realized. It's unrealizable. I mean, the project was taken over by the French and realized in Guadeloupe Memorial Act by François Hollande. But the museum that Glissant imagined is unrealizable. There is a Musée du Tout Monde, which is a mobile museum activated by his friends and family in memory of that project. What does a project mean as a project when it has no possible ends? Those are some of the questions I'm interested in. I don't know if I can even call them methods, but they're just questions that give us life.
Thank you, Tony. Amandine, with transplantation, you were speaking about how when working with families and family archives, you sometimes had, some of the members who were not necessarily comfortable about, the archive being out there. And I think that it's, of course, a matter of intimacy. You spoke about voyeurism as well, and how much we often want to make things visible, but forget about or have to be reminded that it shouldn't also be voyeuristic. I'm wondering how we could think about voyeurism, but in the frame of transmission. because I think that for younger generations, like there is this strong importance of having access to stories like this, and we often see that the institutions don't necessarily have the resources educational institutions don't have the resources to be able to provide the education that's needed. And I think that projects like yours and many others are actually filling the gaps of education, but still have difficulties doing so because they have to respect, the opacity of, these witnesses. So I wonder if you have you could go more on that question of the family, the intimacy, and how much you can build trust when you do this work.
C'est compliqué. Un exemple, non, je dirais que oui, une histoire. Je dirais que ça prend du temps. Par exemple, dans ce travail qu'on avait commencé et qui n'a pas de fin, en fait, qui va peut-être continuer, reprendre avec ces deux familles et ces ateliers qui étaient participatifs où les gens venaient avec leurs archives, mais plus spécifiquement sur cette histoire, enfin, ces familles avec qui on a travaillé, on a dû sortir de nos attentes de programmation. Je pense que quand on fait de la programmation, on se dit ah, ce projet, il faut qu'il sorte à telle période. On va faire cette exposition digitale dans 4 mois. Et là, on s'est rendu compte qu'en fait, justement, ces résistances légitimes des familles nous obligeaient à penser ce projet en dehors de en dehors de la curation, en fait, en dehors de la programmation et que ça prenne le temps qu'il faut et aussi de valoriser d'autres manières de ne pas être nécessairement, nous, on ne voulait pas acquérir ces archives. Déjà, c'était juste, on se refuse à être un lieu avec des archives physiques. On a eu des propositions de dons d'archives familiales, même de familles plutôt coloniales qui ont été liées, françaises, qui ont été liées à la colonisation et qui ont des archives du Sénégal, de la Guadeloupe lors des missions mais on a refusé d'être ça parce qu'on n'a déjà pas les moyens économiques pour gérer une préservée. Mais au-delà de ça, parce que ça ne m'intéresse pas vraiment, c'est plutôt les histoires qui se racontent à travers ces archives qui sont importantes et donc valoriser d'autres formes que juste le visuel. Comme je le disais, la dimension sonore, elle est importante, on enregistre. C'était pas nous qui étions. Ce qui était intéressant, c'était que dans cette recherche, c'était les petits-enfants qui, en fait, faisaient ce travail aussi avec leur famille, les grands-parents. Donc, c'était eux qui posaient les questions et ça a recréé, en fait, une simple conversation. La recherche qui donnait un prétexte pour que ces conversations se créent au sein de ces familles. Et donc, c'est ça qui m'intéresse. On a montré des archives, mais c'est plutôt toutes les conversations intimes qui ont pu découler de manière interne dans ces familles qui est pour moi le véritable impact de ce projet. Et, euh, et après, c'est quand même important ce qu'on a essayé de faire dans certaines familles, c'est que la valeur attribuée à certaines de ces images, c'est une valeur qui est intime, mais qui, d'un point de vue extérieur, devient pour nous aussi autre chose. Par exemple, retrouver pour une autre famille qui est une famille guadeloupéenne sénégalaise qui a vécu entre Marseille et Paris, en Île-de-France. Et dans les archives de la période marseillaise de cette famille, il y avait un concours de Miss. Alors que en fait, on annonce, que le premier concours de Miss Noire en France est dans les années 2000, mais il y en avait déjà en fait dans les années 80, qui s'organisaient de manière associative à Marseille, en Île-de-France. Et là, ça ouvre une perspective vers une histoire, oui, de concours de beauté, mais à visée communautaire, qui rappelle ce qui se passe dans le contexte britannique, qui est beaucoup exploré par Autograph et PB, et dont on a des traces parce que des photographes noirs ont fait ce travail. Et ça nous a mené aussi à interroger la question du photographe noir en France. Parce qu'en fait, ces archives, et il y a beaucoup d'archives de moments festifs où en fait, c'est pas nécessairement les membres, il y a toujours un membre de la famille ou quelqu'un extérieur à la famille qui est le photographe. Mais on ne sait pas son nom. Mais il y a toujours, donc, essayer de retrouver en fait aussi qui étaient ces artistes, qui étaient ces photographes en fait, ou bien des histoires aussi toujours dans cette famille guadeloupéenne sénégalaise. C'était intéressant, il y avait un studio, un photo en studio du grand-père quand il arrive en France dans la fin des années 60. Et donc, il y a cette continuité de la pratique de la photographie en studio que dans le monde de l'art contemporain, on associe à l'art africain, à Selou Keita, mais qui en fait a aussi existé en France dans ces communautés immigrées. Donc moi, en tant que chercheuse, ça ouvre ces pistes-là et c'est en discuter avec les familles pour justement leur dire que ça ouvre des pistes où plus on va faire j'espère dans la durée, d'ateliers de recherche avec la famille. Au final, c'est comment on crée une histoire collective et visuelle qui ne soit pas une histoire visuelle qui est celle qu'il y a dans un musée comme celui de l'immigration au Palais de la Porte Dorée, où c'est un musée avec des images ethnographiques en fait. Donc moi, ce qui m'intéresse, c'est comment, en repartant de ces pratiques photographiques vernaculaires, de ces familles-là, on propose une histoire visuelle de l'immigration en France qui ne soit pas ethnographique, sociologique, mais qui soit comment ces familles ont vécu et ont documenté leur expérience. Et qui parle, enfin, on a eu des moments, je finirai sur ça, mais dans toujours ces conversations qui se créent entre les petits-enfants et enfants et les parents, grands-parents, c'est aussi réclamer la beauté aussi de ces images et également les moments, enfin, de joie. Enfin, il y avait un ami qui avait, on n'avait pas pu montrer, on n'a pas pu montrer. Donc il y a aussi des projets, enfin des débuts de recherche avec des familles qu'on n'a pas montré parce que ça n'était pas arrivé à un stade où, mais pour autant le projet a quand même existé et existe quand même parce qu'il a créé cette conversation familiale qui moi m'intéresse. Qu'on montre les photos ou pas, ensuite c'est pas, voilà, c'est pas le plus intéressant, mais où en tout cas lui et d'autres se disaient c'est fou aussi comment en fait on a une vision de nos parents, enfin de leurs parents, en tout cas immigrés, qui est toujours liée à la question du labeur, l'immigré. Alors qu'en fait, ces images, elles montrent aussi des moments de loisirs. Et c'est aussi réenvisager bah, visuellement, en fait, comment on crée un imaginaire visuel qui ne soit pas juste justement ce qu'on trouve. Ethnographiquement, c'est plutôt tout le labeur, mais là, c'est des moments plutôt de scène familiale, des choses qu'on trouve peu dans ces archives-là, plus institutionnelles. Euh, donc voilà, je pense que l'idée, c'est pas tellement de créer une archive qui réunirait toutes ces images, mais plutôt, en tout cas, en proposant de temps en temps digitaliser, faire des enregistrements des histoires orales de créer, voilà, d'ouvrir des perspectives qui puissent mener en fait à une histoire collective, mais aussi que ça puisse aussi être d'intérêt pour les artistes, les jeunes artistes. C'est ce que tu évoquais, ce besoin, il y a un vrai besoin de réclamer ces histoires personnelles, et de pas justement devoir euh, utiliser des archives institutionnelles qui ne parlent pas de tout ça, ne parlent pas de cette intimité, enfin, donc c'est vraiment un, il y a un besoin artistique, mais qui est toujours dans la manière, dans tout cas moi les artistes avec qui je travaille, il y a toujours une réflexion sur comment détourner, protéger ces archives, les rendre plus opaques aussi, ne pas les montrer telles quelles. Et ce que j'aime avec, en tout cas, la dimension plus, enfin, exposition, c'est aussi ces moments où on a un public qui ne vient pas nécessairement dans des musées. En tout cas, c'est ce que moi, ma pratique, que ce soit transplantation au Palais de Tokyo, je tends vers ça, c'est voilà, avoir un public transgénérationnel et des familles qui, voilà, nécessairement ne viennent pas et se confrontent en fait au travail de leurs enfants euh, dans ces moments-là. Mais ça crée en fait une conversation toujours, ouais. Voilà.
So Awa told me we had until 5:30, and you told me to end. And I had a question for Sarah. So I'll go with the question for Sarah. Yeah, thank you. Just quickly, in what you shared, Sarah, you spoke about the ruins, and, you know, thinking about places where there has been, you know, physical destruction. You know, evoked wars, and you also spoke about the resurrection of the archive. And I was wondering how, in a museum space, we can, you know, like practice healing in that sense, and how that, you know, like translates into the work that you do or that you are planning to do. That will be the last question.
I'll try and be quick. Obviously, it's you know, it's of no, you know, of what's happening right now in the world. We're seeing the constant destruction and overriding of people, of history. As we can see in the current wars that are going on, that, you know, immediate target of libraries, of cultural institutions, of universities. These places are known to be, you know, first targeted places because they hold so much evidence. And I think that the way that these artists have been working now through their practices, and I would say even more so the contemporary artists and digital activists that are online right now, constantly trying to save and resurrect, you know, so many films and texts and memories, you know, to share with the world in order to, you know, make known our history and our livelihoods. So there's a lot that's happening right now in terms of, I guess, artistic activism with archives as countering all of these violences that are ongoing. And yeah, I think we can end it there. Yeah, thank you so much.
Do you want to take questions? We still have 10 minutes before. Yeah. Aisato has a question. Yeah. Allô? Je m'appelle Aïssatou Bambou. Je voulais marquer qui était déjà posée par Marie-Hélène à l'endroit d'Amandine Nana, mais je vais quand même revenir un tout petit peu là-dessus parce que, bon, on parle d'archives et je voulais savoir si, lors de vos rencontres avec les familles, pour reconstituer un peu les archives, vous avez eu à parler de danse, comme vous avez eu à rencontrer par hasard le défilé de mode. Est-ce que vous avez eu à parler de danse? Parce que nous, les artistes, dans la danse, aujourd'hui, ça nous intéresse beaucoup. Parce que comme vous devez le savoir, nos danses n'ont pas été souvent écrites par nous-mêmes. Et les rares écrits qui existent sur ces danses-là ont été faits par un autre regard et donc décrits d'une certaine manière. Aujourd'hui, notre problème, c'est qu'avec le rush qui s'est effectué à notre endroit pour nos rythmes et nos danses, et qui a une vitesse tellement rapide et aussitôt envoyé en Europe ou ailleurs et réenseigné d'une autre manière, nous en sommes arrivés à nous poser la question, est-ce qu'il faut maintenant qu'on se mette à écrire nos danses de manière qu'elles soient vraiment enseignées dans leur originalité et dans leur véracité. Alors, je voudrais savoir si vous, dans vos rencontres, comment est-ce que vous arrivez à lever un peu, comme vous dites, cette croyance spirituelle qui accompagne souvent les récits que vous allez recevoir des familles et tout. Comment vous arrivez à contourner un peu ces croyances pour en obtenir la totalité et surtout la véracité de ces dires. Je vous remercie. Donna, can we also take this question? So that's the last one.
My question has to do with like audiovisual archive. Today, all the archives that we need in terms of film and television in most of French-speaking Africa, mainly in Senegal, they're not here. They're in France, in Ina. And if I, as Senegalese, wants to make a documentary on Senghor, for example, I have to pay the government of France in order to be able to have it. That's a fact. You talk about Saint Ousmane. none of the Samuel Usman film, not even one, belongs to Senegal. So it's one thing to talk about the archives that we don't have, but I'm thinking about the generations to come, because the films that we're making today are going to be the archives for those generations. And if those films don't belong to Senegal or to these countries, then it's going to be the same thing that's going to be repeating. So I'm putting the question there for you guys to see, what do you think about that? And what's the solution to be able to have archives in terms of audiovisual that we can use and make? And just a contribution to you, Ntonje, I would strongly suggest you try to meet Umusi, who's a stylist and who worked on the clothes already with Samuel Usman of the film Samurai. And the clothing will say a lot about the project and its sources as well.
It's actually a question for Marie-Helene, yeah, for you, because I think HKW has this amazing collection of documents and archives. And I think what Ava and Sarah have kind of alluded to in the world of archive, there isn't just one archive. The digital archive is a big one. And we just had a workshop in Asia Art Archive and the Al Mahdi Archive, an archive in Abu Dhabi, collected by Salva Mudvadi, who since 35 years brings documents from the Arab world. And it's now actually, but no one from NYU is here anymore, to NYU Abu Dhabi. And it's an archive with like physical objects, you know. So she described how difficult it is to even bring these documents to Abu Dhabi because of, you know, the fact that it's not easy to bring documents from different parts of the world into the region. And so we discussed this question also in relation to, in our case, Sharjah and the long history of the biennial there, the African Institute, the archive on Organiser there now. Like, what is the role of an institution, right? And so I think with what's the role, or could be, I mean, feeling this responsibility of participating in building an archive, but that is that archive, and talking to different archives. What does it mean? So I'm curious to hear how you, because I think we're very interested in this living archive and how it makes your life. And the HKW, the institution you work for, is really an institution who has always very well dealt with this, making an archive accessible and making exhibitions. So I'm just be interested in how you continue this now, also with this question you had about using it as a healing, like as a purpose for healing.
I think I'll invite Amandine to reply, then Tone, and then I'll reply, but that would be the closing, yeah? And okay, yeah, please.
Merci pour votre question. Pour vous répondre, non, dans la question de la danse, en tout cas, qui pourrait aider à retrouver des pas de danse, c'est pas quelque chose qu'on a vu. Mais par exemple, sur la question de comment on fait pour en arriver à une autre fin, comme vous dites, en fait, on n'arrive pas avec une intention justement on accepte aussi le fragment, que ce qu'on a en fait va être fragmenté, et parce que c'est des trajectoires aussi fragmentées, c'est des trajectoires où souvent il n'y a pas aussi d'archives, les archives qui sont perdues. Il y a plein d'histoires de familles qui n'ont pas d'archives. Moi, par exemple, je viens d'une famille où il y a très peu d'archives parce qu'elles ont été perdues. Donc ça, c'est aussi quelque chose auquel on essaye de penser. Là, par exemple, des ateliers qui, pour des personnes qui n'ont pas d'archives, ou qui n'ont pas pu les transporter avec eux dans leur parcours migratoire. Donc voilà, c'était juste pour dire qu'en tout cas, on n'essaye pas chercher quelque chose de complet, mais aussi de faire face aux fragmentés. Et sur la danse, pas en lien avec ce projet-là, mais en lien avec l'exposition en cours au Palais de Tokyo dont je suis la commissaire. Il y a j'ai travaillé aussi avec une danseuse qui s'appelle Dorothée Munyaneza, et qui va donc faire trois performances le 5-7 décembre, 5-7-8 décembre, et avec qui on a ces conversations justement aussi, et pour en revenir où la danse, en fait, c'est aussi, ça renvoie au corps qui est aussi une archive. Et quand on s'intéresse aux danses, quelque chose qui m'intéresse beaucoup, les danses populaires qui émergent entre l'Afrique de l'Ouest, enfin l'Afrique entièrement, on va dire, et la diaspora, c'est quelque chose qui, aujourd'hui, grâce à des réseaux sociaux comme TikTok, je me dis qu'on va avoir des archives de ces danses urbaines qui naissent tous les 4 mois, il y a des nouvelles danses, et où les gens, en fait, se filment en train de danser, en train d'apprendre des pas. Et enfin, en tout cas, je pense que pour aujourd'hui, pour le monde contemporain, on aura des archives de ça grâce à ces réseaux sociaux et ces formes de... Et c'est intéressant parce que quand on croise ces différents contenus, ça permet de montrer des liens encore aujourd'hui entre des danses qui émergent, je sais pas, au Gabon comme actuellement le Cham, avec des danses qui continuent à émerger aux États-Unis, donc dans les pas. Et c'est ce qui m'intéresse, c'est justement savoir d'où ça remonte, quelle forme de danse plus ancienne, en fait, on pourrait retrouver ces mêmes pas-là. Donc voilà. Et je vais laisser, mais c'est une très bonne question, mais je pense que je vais laisser la parole aux autres pour y répondre aussi sur la vôtre.
It was just a quick response to Christian's question about archives. It's unfortunate that we're wrapping up soon because I think this would have been a key point to actually discuss because, of course, archives are great and we're all archival lit, but it's a question of who gets access to the archive and especially what archives are we talking about. I think maybe from speaking from independent practice, well, not sorry, independent practice, but prior, I founded CAS in response to precisely that question of access to archives using the digital platform. Being a Tumblr generation kid, and when Instagram in 2013 was the place where you could circulate a form of accessible, you had an accessible method of circulating knowledge production, drawing on past histories and past artistic and cultural interventions by practitioners from the African continent and beyond. And when I founded CAS, it was precisely in response to that. And it was my frustration around being around peers that were as interested in visual culture as myself, but could not get access to libraries, could not get access to certain films by African filmmakers because they were lying and collecting dust within distribution companies, or they just did not know where to find them. And so one simple solution was to actually found an Instagram page in which I would share all this material online for people to access. And something that we did with CAS at the time was to compile an extensive film list, and where we made over 200 different African films, except viewing links that people could actually go and see online. And most of these films were classics that were on YouTube, but you just had to dig because you would not else be able to find it. But it was one way of trying to make archives accessible to people in a way that it could circulate beyond boundaries and circumvent borders. But more importantly, also poking a bit at the hierarchy of who gets to be at the hierarchy of intellectual thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the great, beautiful ironies is once Cass, yourself and your friends circulated these films, once they got into modalities of circulation again, they were then held back. So, right. So that's a great challenge, right? Is that you made this film visible, not only for us, but also for the institution, for the watchdogs. And they were like, oh, by the way, that's our shit. Let's get it back, right? That's the, yeah. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we have to get our stuff back, our objects, you know, whatever they are. All of our shit is in Europe. But I think that there are other questions that I want to use this space to maybe to raise, since this discussion is so much mediated by the question of the archive, is going back to cinema, or some say the practice of cinema in the broader sense. Can the archive consider unrealized films? Because I mean, if you take in consideration the capital intensive, process of filmmaking. I mean, if you're an African filmmaker, if you have a tremendous career, you've made 2 films. You've taught 225 films, and you've managed to realize 2. That's kind of more or less the economy outside of an economic principle such as, say, Nollywood and similar, right? So, but those economic processes they are their own centers. So I'm not considering them here. Make I clarify that one. But so I think that will the archive and questions of restitution take seriously ideas as opposed to only material? I think that this is a question, because at some point we have to be able to speak of our production, intellectual, artistic, and otherwise, outside of the paradigm of lack, i.e. the things we do not have, we cannot have access to, we're not able to do, etc., which does not put aside the political work of gathering our stuff back, right? That's, some people call it heritage. But I think in some ways it's so focused on objects and not enough on, memories, ideas, less tangible, but certainly not less valuable, processes. Part of our interest with this project of Semben is that the film was not made, but it was. It's unmakeable, but at the same time, it was because he worked on it for 40 years with hundreds of people. People devoted their lives to this project. Do we cancel it out? All of the biographies written about Semben mention this project as an anecdote. It hardly ever goes beyond 2 paragraphs. Why? Because there's no object to study for this kind of pseudo-objective review and then produce art history as a result of that. But it's a 40-year-long intensive project. Organizations, people, billions of CFA went into that. But it cannot be historicized because there's no object to refer to. Those are some of the questions I think we are ready to raise now while we get our shit back.
Rapidement pour la question de Stéphanie, in English. No, first, I think, je pense qu'il y a aussi, je suis parfaitement d'accord avec ce que vous avez partagé, et je pense qu'il y a aussi une responsabilité qui doit être prise par nos institutions, parce que s'il y avait eu la possibilité d'archiver ces travaux ici, ça aurait été fait. Nos institutions ne font pas le travail qu'il faut faire. Donc, si les artistes qui galèrent pendant des décennies pour faire un travail n'arrivent pas à voir de suite, c'est malheureux, mais c'est normal qu'ils aillent chercher ailleurs. Donc, nos institutions doivent faire ce travail d'archivage aussi et doivent créer les espaces de transmission dont on a besoin pour que ce que nous produisons reste chez nous. On est en train de travailler sur le festival de Tashkent qui s'est tenu à Ouzbékistan de 68 à 88. Donc 20 ans de festival où c'était des réalisateurs de films qui étaient invités d'Afrique, Amérique latine, mais aussi de la région de Ouzbékistan et moi. Et tout ce qui a été fait là-bas n'est pas facile à trouver. Et surtout quand il s'agit du continent africain. Et la plupart des gens qui peuvent en parler aujourd'hui sont très âgés. On a fait une interview avec Souleymane Cissé, qui en a parlé parce qu'il a montré un de ses films là-bas. Je pense que c'était Den Mousso, et qui a eu un succès énorme, mais il n'arrivait pas à nous dire, à nous donner des histoires de ce temps, de son temps là-bas, parce que déjà, sa mémoire est altérée quand il s'agit de ça. Mais il se rappelle que c'était la première fois qu'il rencontrait des réalisateurs de films d'Amérique latine, d'Asie et tout ça, et que c'était très important pour lui. Et il a même dit que l'idée de faire le FESPACO leur est venue de là-bas, parce qu'ils se sont retrouvés très loin de leur géographie, où ils se disaient, mais attendez, on doit faire quelque chose comme ça chez nous. Donc, je pense que, ouais, il a aussi beaucoup parlé, bien sûr, de nos institutions, de la responsabilité que nos institutions doivent prendre et tout ça, tout ça. Donc, oui, il faut qu'on ait ces travaux chez nous, mais il faut que nos institutions fassent le travail. And for your question, Stephanie, so yesterday I spoke about HKV, telling the story of it. So, you know, like it being a Congress hall that was donated by the US to West Germany in the mid-50s, and it being turned into a House of World Cultures in the late 80s, and us being the new team that started 2 years ago with Bonaventure as the director, the first Black director of an institution like that, the first director of color of an institution like that since its inception in the 50s, the mid-50s. So when we came in, what was important for us is to think about what it means to be a house of world cultures. And how do we think about a home instead of a house? So we unpacked that a lot, you know, thinking about, okay, who are the people we are bringing in here? What are the knowledges that we want to bring in? And also, what are the worlds we are talking about? So the question of restitution and reparation, they came from the very start, where it's not related to any, you know, like material heritage, but it's related to the idea of having a house of world cultures at the first place, and about thinking about the responsibility that is. Maybe one example I can give is the project Echoes de Buralanda, so Echoes of the Brother Countries. That is a 2 years long research project that we did looking at histories of migration in the GDR. So we started working on this before we arrived in the house, so in 2022. And the brother countries were all these socialist and communist leaning countries with whom Germany signed contract in order to recruit labor force after the Second World War. And in these countries, for instance, on the list you have, you know, Angola, Mozambique, but you also had a lot of people from the Second World War to the fall of the war. So you have all those who came in the frame of the brother countries, but you also had a lot of political refugees that came to Germany at the time, East Germany. So a lot of people came from Iraq, from Syria, from Palestine, from Cuba, and it became, you know, like a time where a lot of people from the global south arrived in East Germany and worked in the industry sector in order to rebuild the country. So for us, thinking about reparation, it was important to address this question because it has never been addressed in the way we did it. Of course, you know, there are some books, some university professors spoke about it, but we wanted to go to the community. We wanted to talk to the families. So it's like third generation, fourth generations of these people who came, those who came to work, you know, like they had contracts that were saying, okay, you would come to work, but then at some point you go back to your country. So they were not allowed to stay. After the fall of the war, they realized that actually, you know, like the Germans are happy that the wall is falling, but it's actually a threat for us because we know that what is happening in West Germany would just expand, you know, in the whole country. So many of them, they had to flee. They were like, okay, we are leaving. And those people, they had, many of them had families. For the time where they were there, they met with, you know, like German women or men and, you know, had their kids and etc. And they were forced to leave without the family. So the partners stayed, the kids stayed, and you had like the beginning of different type of stories, you know, very, very, very sad stories, you know, a set of oppression, you know, of course, racial discrimination, you know, like economic instability, all sorts of things. So we started thinking about what it actually means to be like, who are the Germans, literally? So are we thinking about Germany just from a perspective of, whiteness, or do we want to think about a plural Germany that was collectively built by those people who came? So that's what the Ecos de Bruderlande was looking at. And one of the sub-team of the project was, what is the cost of amnesia and what is the price of memory? So this, translated into different collaborations with art institutions from the places where these workers came from. So for us, it was important to tell the story, not just from the perspective of Germany, but to go to Angola, to go to Mozambique, to go to Vietnam, to go to Algeria, to Ghana, different places where this history actually exists and it's also untold. So we wanted to, create some sort of a quilt like that to be able to tell the story, fully, but that's into brackets because it's actually never full. There is even more to do. So we had an exhibition that we've also done in the house. I think maybe you saw it, public programs and etc. So for us, it was important to do this. In the exhibition, we had historical works that were done in the time of the GDR by contract workers who were artists themselves. And we also had contemporary works. So these are commission work that were done by contemporary artists in, conversation with the historical works that were there present. So, and for us, that's also a way of building a living archive. So not something that you will just forget in the past. And we took that as a methodology. So how can we build something that informs, the past, informs the now, and informs also the future? And then a second example, what we've just launched is a project called Heimaten. It's a 4 years long program that's looking at the question of the homeland. In German, so Heimat is like this, it means homeland, but it's an exclusive way of approaching the homeland as well. So we've been thinking about dismantling that idea of the homeland, thinking about, okay, how can we bring an approach of multiple homelands in one homeland? And also, how can we think about the question of ownership? So the one prompt question that we have is, who owns Germany? And who owns Germany is a question to which we will reply for the next 4 years. And what we did in terms of structure is to think together with other art institutions that are in Berlin, in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, broader than just Berlin. And all of us will have some sort of decentralized festival every year, and then different types of programs that are all under the umbrella of Heimaten. And the first program was the exhibition that we just opened in September called Forgive Us Our Trespassing. Our trespasses that Victor actually is part of. So we are thinking about trespassing as actually an act of resistance and resilience. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of thinking. Thank you very much.